So we'll talk a little bit about mimicry, about mirror neurons, about empathy, and some of this is also in your modules. And so I won't play the videos, I'll go through it relatively quickly. And you'll also have access to the slide deck. So from a very early age, we mimic, right? If you stick out your tongue to a baby, the baby will eventually stick out their tongue. And then we learn to smile in response to other people's smiles. As we get older, if someone yawns around us, it tends to be contagious, right? Even if we're not tired. Even looking at the slides right now, I want to yawn. If someone turns their head to look at something, especially if they have an emotional reaction on their face, you often turn your head to look at the same thing. And so the science behind some of this is related to mirror neurons. And this concept was really discovered by researchers, I think in Italy, who were studying like brain mapping a monkey. And the monkey was, connected to all the electrodes. And the researchers decided to take a break and eat lunch. But they ate lunch in the same room. And as the researchers were eating, they noticed that even though the monkey wasn't moving, the different areas on his brain were lighting up as if he was moving. And looking more closely at it, they noticed that it was as if every time the researcher pulled the sandwich to his mouth, the monkey was also pulling something to his mouth, except again, the monkey wasn't moving. He was just staring at the researchers eating. And so other researchers built on this concept. And it turns out that the same areas in our brain responsible for motor movement, so in the motor cortex, light up whether we're actually doing something like moving in some sort of way, or whether we're thinking about it, or whether we are watching someone else do that movement. And so this is the concept of mirror neurons, that when we see someone else doing a movement, and there are certain situations in which this is more relevant than others. But anyways, if we see them doing movements, our brain lights up too. And that's it's part of learning, right? It's probably best that we don't just like learn to do everything without actually observing someone else make the mistake or actually do it right the first time. And this goes for so many different behaviors. And then there's a psychological phenomenon called the chameleon effect. And actually mimicking another person helps you build trust and positive feelings. And so when we're talking about in-group versus out-group, if another person that we are engaging or interacting with is mimicking our movements, then we tend to think of them as an us. People who are being mimicked become more generous towards the person who mimics them. And then that becomes an adaptive, function of mimicry. So then we tend to do it even more, right? Mimicking another person's body movements during an interview, like crossing your legs or kind of tilting your head, as long as it's subtle and they don't realize that you're just copying their behavior, it actually increases the chance that an interviewer will rate you positively. In a different experiment, the servers or waiters or waitresses mimicked the customer by repeating their order verbatim. And so exactly the way that it was stated by the customer versus summarizing it or just saying it in the usual fashion. And the people who stated or repeated them verbatim actually got more tips. And then being mimicked also increases a person's likelihood of helping their partner when he or she is in need. And so one study found that 100% of participants who had been mimicked helped their conversation partners pick up a bunch of pins that had been dropped, whereas only a third of participants who hadn't been mimicked helped out. So it's also a way to increase reciprocity and cooperation, right? Because we're grouping each other as us's. And it's not all about liking and attraction. So by synchronizing your manners with another person, you heighten that trust. Um, and there's research showing how these subtle things can also help negotiations go more smoothly. But we have to be careful because if in another study, participants watched several videos of staged interviews between two people. And some of the videos showed an interviewer that was kind of being rude and unfriendly. And then the other group showed videos where the interviewer had positive attributes and was friendly. And so the interviewers or the interviewees either mimicked the interviewer or didn't. And this included crossing their legs or chin touching. And participants were not instructed to watch the person, the interviewee who was mimicking. They were only instructed to watch the interviewer. But after watching the video, participants evaluated the person who was being interviewed, the interviewee who was doing the mimics, on general competence, likability, and trustworthiness. The participants rated the interviewees who mimicked the behavior of the unfriendly interviewer as less competent as those who didn't mirror him. The qualifications were the same. And so in the eyes of the outside observers, imitating an undesirable model incurs reputational cost. So this is relevant to in-grouping and out-grouping. This is relative or related to increasing trust and cooperation between different groups, potentially, whether it's an individual or like mass groups. But it also still feeds back into the whole stereotyping too, right? Because if they act like them, we're going to probably think of them within that same category. So expanding on this concept, we get to the point of empathy. And there are several brain areas that are relevant to this concept. And so insula is one of them. Anterior cingulate cortex is another. And the amygdala, of course. The amygdala is always involved. The anterior cingulate cortex and the insula in particular are both involved in perceptions of pain. And that is both social pain and physical pain, but also like our experience of it, and then imagining someone else experiencing that too. And oftentimes it's related because when we see someone else experiencing that pain, we feel it. And so the same areas of our brain lights up, kind of like the mirror neuron thing, right? This also, the insula in particular is also involved in like disgust, which we have discussed earlier. And this also intersects with in-grouping and out-grouping, right? These areas that are relevant to empathy and relevant to feeling someone else's pain light up preferentially for other people who are in the in-group, right? And so this research experiment showed videos of people either getting a painful stimulus or a non-painful stimulus. And they looked at white subjects and white faces, or Chinese subjects and Chinese faces, and then they mixed and matched. So the areas of the brain that lit up did so preferentially for in-groups. And so you can see for the anterior cingulate cortex and the amygdala, or the this is the left frontal. So the insula, I don't think was on here, but the anterior cingulate cortex lit up preferentially if you were white, looking at a white face who was in pain. And then for Chinese subjects, exactly the opposite. If you were Chinese and you were looking at Chinese face that was in pain, your anterior cingulate cortex lit up. And then you can see it was kind of the opposite for other areas of the brain. And so insula, again, body sensations and feelings, both ours and theirs. And then disgust, both social disgust and also like visceral disgust, like smelling something gross. And then the medial prefrontal cortex, this is really involved in perspective taking and social judgments. And so this is actually more active when thinking about the in-group rather than the out-group, because we think of them as like, you know, what are they going through? What does that mean to them? We can kind of visualize this concept outside of the interaction. So mirror neurons and empathy. We talked about mirror neurons with motor mimicry, but we also have emotional mimicry. And that's all related to this sense of empathy. But, you know, just whenever you're in a group of people and you're, you know, interacting, or you're in that group, especially if it's a group of us's, right? And then people start laughing or having a good time. It's just, the feeling is contagious, right? If someone is distressed, you're distressed. We get that way when we are, you know, watching movies, right? Completely fictional characters. We feel their pain and start crying or laughing, or, you know, experiencing what they experience. And that is related to all of this. But there's also a social context component, because that contagion of emotion and that emotional and autonomic mimicry is not the same for in-groups and out-groups. It does involve several brain locations and several hormones or chemicals or neurotransmitters. So oxytocin is for sure released. And remember, that not only is like the love component, it not only you know, functions in other ways in the body, but it also makes you much more protective of us's and much more aggressive towards thems. So it's almost like a protective. Think of it as like a mama bear hormone. And so how do we mimic someone's emotions? Well, because we know that there are certain subtle changes in our expressions, in our behavior, in our posture, things that we don't maybe even realize that we're seeing, but we know that those are associated with certain feelings because we've had them. And so if we also have mirror neurons for motor, you know, motor actions, all of these things are related to motor actions, right? And vasomotor actions. And if we see it in another person, our brain is going to light up the same. And because some of those actions are also so closely tied to an emotional response, like if your heart rate is really, really fast, that can actually be anxiety provoking, because we have this physical sensation or this particular movement that has been associated with an emotional reaction. Like, you can't separate any of that. And so as these tracks and these connections are laid down in the brain throughout life, once one thing is triggered, another thing is going to be triggered, right? And so when we see someone else and they blush, and we're a type of person who also blushes, we feel their embarrassment or whatever. And that can create a sense of empathy. But it can also create some distress if they act in a way that is like incongruent with how we would expect them to act. More later. So perception of others' behavior, because this also plays a role. So another person being in an out group or another person having a different social status than you will influence your perception of their behavior, right? And then mimicry or imitation is increased by that in-group membership, but also wanting to affiliate with other people or liking the other person. And then that increases cooperation, and then liking of you by them, and conformity. But it doesn't occur indiscriminately. We don't automatically catch the emotions of out-group members. So another study showed a videotape of Ronald Reagan expressing happiness and anger at different points during a news conference. Republicans reported feeling happy or angry at the same time that Reagan was expressing these emotions. And then Democrats reported feeling negative during the entire news conference. So the happiness wasn't contagious. And so to summarize, we have a social interaction. We have emotions that are tied to that interaction. We might have particular arousal or, vasomotor blushing or pupil dilation, or sometimes even blinking. That implies the emotion that we are experiencing. We also have expressions like emotional facial expressions, right? And that also involves certain, um, muscle movements. And so when someone smiles and your motor neurons, your mirror neurons also light up and you smile, because that physical action is also associated with a certain emotion, that emotion is catching. So it's not magic, it's just neurology. And then we have some cognition or some kind of representation. Oh, I bet they're happy, or maybe even association with that. Oh, I bet they're a nice person or a good person, whatever. And the social perception of where they are, where they belong, where you belong, what that means, the group interactions, all of these play a role in this whole process. But it's complex. But there is a scientific basis for empathy and for mimicry, and it'll help inform some of the things that we can do to decrease bias.